Thank you for coming this morning to this talk. We have with us the esteemed Dr. Alexa Still. She is visiting us from Oberlin, Ohio, by way of New Zealand. She is the current professor of flute at the Oberlin Conservatory, former professor of flute at the Sydney Conservatory, and for those musicians in the audience, a previous performer with the New Zealand Philharmonic. We are thrilled to have her here on campus to share her expertise in music, flute, and New Zealand as part of the themed semester. So without any further ado, I'd like you to give a round of applause for Alexa Still.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. It's a great pleasure to be here at part of your Oceania semester. It's really nice to talk to people who know that New Zealand is actually down under. When I was a student in New York in the mid-'80s, I would get people asking me what the weather was like cold up by there, by Greenland. And I would get people complimenting me on my excellent command of the English language. Which, although my accent's kind of weird, actually New Zealand speaks English. So that was a bit disappointing, really. In 1985, when I was reaching the end of my graduate studies, the Greenpeace flagship boat, the Rainbow Warrior, was bombed. And this happened in Auckland Harbour in New Zealand. And this actually made what we considered at the time extraordinary international coverage, partly because it was bombed by the French Secret Service, and partly because when the police arrested the guys who did it, they called home, which identified who they were really quickly, which seems kind of a dumb thing to do. But also, a photographer died in the bombing, and the boat went down, he drowned. So New Zealand was sort of left with this international incident. And unfortunately, their allies, that would be the US, the UK, and Europe, pretty much decided to ignore it too. And I think that's when New Zealand sort of finally discovered it was by itself. These other countries really couldn't be bothered interfering with their relationships over a small incident in New Zealand. That making the 8th page of the New York Times was considered pretty great coverage. I think that what I'm going to talk about today is not so much facts and figures that you can look up in a book, but more about how New Zealand is the way it is and how I think that happened, and a little bit of why New Zealanders are kind of odd. So, what was that gibberish I started off with? Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. That was a formal greeting in Maori. The Maori culture has a great deal of emphasis on proper etiquette at events. If you were talking on the phone with a New Zealander, they might say, Kiora would be hello, or hi. Haere mai would be welcome. Welcome to my place. So the Polynesians discovered New Zealand about 700 years ago. That seems like a long time in New Zealand because it's kind of a new country. I realize if you've been to Europe, 700 years is nothing. They sailed there on canoes and they brought with them amazing Polynesian culture and rats. And unfortunately, the rats were just the first of many destructive species imported by various visitors. New Zealand still battles rats, stoats, possums, you name it, things brought in by Europeans and the Maori to protect the native bird life. Before the Maori showed up, New Zealand was this huge bird sanctuary with no predators at all. Then the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman discovered the country. Zeeland was a place in Holland, so he called this place New Zealand, and that name stuck. Although many Maori and Pākehā, white people like me, would consider Aotearoa a much nicer name. That's the land of the long white cloud. Author Bill Bryson was a famous travel writer, and he wrote a great book about Australia called The Sunburned Country. I think if he had written about New Zealand, it would be the land of extensive green mould. It's a very wet place. Some of the northern parts are considered to be warm tropical rainforests, but much of New Zealand would come under the category of cold rainforest, and yes, there is such a thing, and it's basically wet. And it's not helped by the fact that there is not much in the way of central heating or air conditioning. It's a fairly moderate sort of climate, so people just didn't think that was necessary. If the Scottish hadn't invented sweaters, I think New Zealanders would have. This climate provides a fantastic year-round growing season, producing tremendous growth. So amongst the very dense native forests, there are trees that resemble something like the redwoods you might find in California. Very immense trees that have been there for a very long time. And the bush is very, very dense, very hard to get through. New Zealand's also created by two tectonic plates pushing up out of the ocean. So it's a very, very long mountain range. The result is that this is a very difficult country to get around quickly. The bush is very challenging to get through. Trampers, hikers get lost, sometimes permanently. And it can take a long time to get to various places on the country. You look at a map and you might think Auckland to Gisborne looks like a very short distance. Gisborne, just north of Gisborne, is where the Whale Rider film is set. It's a very beautiful area, but it takes all day to get there because the roads have to wind around all these gullies and hills. It's a very difficult terrain. So the Maori, when they arrived, splintered off into different groups going to different parts of the country where there were flat spots where they could grow things. And over time took up fighting each other, except for the Maori, who were a tribe that wound up on the Chatham Islands very far east of New Zealand. And the Maori really got very good at this fighting stuff. So when the British finally arrived to settle New Zealand, after James Cook had circumnavigated the place and mapped some of it, they were greeted by a native people who were very skilled in guerrilla warfare. They understood politics, and they really understood negotiation. Of course, horrible, horrible, tragic things happened, right, to the native people when the British showed up. They got terrible diseases for which they had no immunity. They were exposed to alcohol and all the problems that brought. The British imposed laws that the Maoris didn't understand or want. They took land in the name of the Queen, and there was a tremendous amount of death from fighting. But I believe that this relationship between the Maori and the British is kind of what sets New Zealand apart. The Maori saw that the British were beholden to a queen and had a royalty. They understood that that was an important thing there. So they immediately created their own. There is still a Maori royal family. They saw that the power of the artillery was impressive, so they immediately set about negotiating for guns. They traded food. They had things the British needed, so they negotiated for that. And then when the time was right, they negotiated treaties over the land. And the most famous of those is the Treaty of Waitangi, which was made in 1840. Of course, the British just didn't pay much attention to the fact they'd promised various things and didn't really do much about it. But that treaty lives, and now that treaty is upheld in court. And the New Zealand government has done their best to honour what the British promised that they would do, and has paid significant reparations, and at this point gives a lot of control over natural resources to the native people, the Maori tribes, and has to negotiate with the Maori about things that involve natural resources. The British military arrived wearing scarlet uniforms and white sashes, which went across their chests, resembling something like a target, actually. And they would march in formation towards their opponents in daylight hours, doing it in a very proper fashion. The Maori, on the other hand, were kind of used to sneaking up on people. And they disguised themselves very well. And they used spies. And they did all the good guerrilla tactics like setting traps and things like that. So for the British military, who were trying to do it the proper way and even dragging around cannon in the swampy mess in New Zealand bush, found that conquering New Zealand was a very drawn-out quagmire, a distant country which took a lot of effort to get stuff to and was taking a very long time. So the British were unable to dominate in New Zealand. They were unable to dominate the native people like they did in many other places in the world. The film The Piano, which I think is being shown in your series, can give you a good idea of what the countryside would have looked like at this time. While the British used Australia as a penal colony and sent their worst people there, the wealthy families in Britain sent the embarrassing relatives they had to New Zealand. That's a great place to go farm, you go over there. And Scotland was in the throes of a potato famine, and they needed people to work in New Zealand, to work for these black sheep in these families. So the British government offered free passage to British citizens, including Scots, who could prove they were of good character. And many Scots, faced with no food in Scotland, took them up on this offer. Many Scots. To this day, the Scottish influence is very profound. In the southern parts of New Zealand, you will hear people speak with quite a Scottish burr in the accents, especially older Kiwis. And I was told once that there are more Scottish bagpipe bands in New Zealand than there are in Scotland. I totally believe that. So the Scottish immigrants and the Maori had a very strong common interest, hatred of the British. And they got along incredibly well. So most New Zealanders at this point can claim some Scottish and or Maori heritage, and probably both. And those people, the Maori and the Scottish, really formed what we know of New Zealand people now. They were remarkably progressive, taking steps such as women's suffrage and instituting an old age pension in 1890. Despite such inherent animosity towards England and becoming self-governing in 1907, inexplicably, New Zealand kept being the farm, basically, for the UK. And for a very long time, exported agricultural goods en masse to the UK. And as more British people got fed up with living in the UK, they moved to New Zealand too. So there were many British immigrants, especially in the early part of the 1900s. These people are still referred to as pommies in New Zealand, prisoner of Mother England. With them, they brought a fondness for odd cultural habits, like having a cup of tea at 11 o'clock in the morning and 2:30 in the afternoon, which you may have noticed the Hobbits did in the Ring trilogy. This is really a thing. I remember when I was a kid being on a train going between one city and the next and actually stopping at about 11 o'clock in the middle of nowhere so people could have a cup of tea and a smoko. The British also brought with them a sense of entitlement to social services, and that probably set up New Zealand towards the social welfare culture it has now. They expected things like education and health services to be provided by the government. When I was a kid, the expectation was that you would complete high school and either learn a trade at a trade school or go to a government-run university for which you were paid a stipend. And then you would get a job, and then you would buy your house. And most people were able to manage to buy a small house on a quarter-acre section, which was lovingly referred to as your quarter-acre paradise. For those who couldn't buy, the government would provide a state house, a well-built single-family dwelling. So everyone had kind of a small house on a small section with a garage out back. That was important because the man of the house would tinker with do-it-yourself projects out back. There's a great film that shows New Zealand at this time called The World's Fastest Indian. It's actually about a New Zealander setting speed records on a motorcycle. It makes sense that you would have a place to work on stuff because everything was brought into the country. It was imported by boat, right? It was very expensive. So you didn't throw things away, you fixed them, and you figured out how to do it yourself. The kids would walk to the local government-run school. Mums were mums, and essentially did everything from preschool education to Meals on Wheels. And social services were provided by tax dollars. All money flowing in and out of the country was strictly controlled. Even when I was a student, you had to apply for permission to make a payment overseas. And if you didn't know someone working on the docks or someone working in the relevant business who could kind of sneak the goods, you couldn't buy the best butter and things like that. It got shipped immediately out of the country. Things like salaries in New Zealand were very low, much lower than other Western civilized countries. To make that worse, the exchange rate was really bad. When I was a kid, it was about 30 or 40 cents US would buy a New Zealand dollar. And people's salaries were really very low compared to the US. But with the growth of air travel, New Zealanders began traveling and seeing the world. I think this may have been inspired by tales from surviving soldiers from World War II, going home and telling stories about far and exotic lands. New Zealand lost about 1 in 4 men during World War II. It had a profound effect on the country. And the post-World War II years also brought many more immigrants, refugees from Europe. And those people perhaps want to travel back to their families they'd left behind. Whatever, traveling for New Zealanders became quite a thing. And it has become a treasured rite of passage. You finish school and off you go for your OE, overseas experience. Everybody does this. Of a population of around 4 to 5 million, they think there are at least 1 million New Zealand passports out of the country at any one time. That's a very high proportion. And New Zealanders brought back progressive ideas and took a fresh look at New Zealand's dependency on exporting a few agricultural products. At one time, New Zealand's workers were either servicing the local population or working producing agricultural goods. In the 80s, I had a t-shirt that very proudly proclaimed, New Zealand, 3 million people, 70 million sheep. Besides lamb, other goods New Zealand exported were all the dairy products, of course, wool, trees for making paper, iron ore, and with the advent of air freight, things just changed radically and got a lot more diverse. Exports more recently might include cricket bats, croissants, flowers, United Nations blue berets, odd things. And of course, you can't beat a Marlborough area white wine. Air travel also brought tourism in, right? Northern Europeans discovered New Zealand as a great destination for cycling. And even now, if you drive around New Zealand, you will run into Germans madly cycling up horrible-looking hills. The US ski team discovered New Zealand as a great place to train in the off-season here, and they can be found in Queensland going up and down the slopes. And when New Zealand won the America's Cup in sailing, sailors from all around the world discovered they could go to New Zealand and rent a boat and sail. Over time, monetary controls were relaxed. And the 70s era of prosperity gradually lifted New Zealand's incomes, and the country built a lot of infrastructure. Now the exchange rate is roughly 10 cents less than the Australian dollar against the greenback, and people have paid a much more competitive wage. New Zealand's roads, communications, networks, hospitals, you name it, stuff is as good as anywhere in the world, maybe sometimes better. And they have a beloved Department of Conservation. New Zealand's students no longer receive stipends to go to school, but are still regulated and heavily subsidised by the government, including a generous loan scheme. But what really put New Zealand on the map internationally was Peter Jackson's Tolkien trilogy and film, The Lord of the Rings. I was first in line to see all of those movies. And tourism exploded in New Zealand as people went to see Middle-earth. The New Zealanders who hadn't already realised that this native land of theirs was very beautiful suddenly realised that actually it was worth a great deal to everybody else. And now more than ever, New Zealanders really treasure their environment. It's a pervasive attitude. Radio New Zealand, the National Broadcasting Service, plays native birdsong along with the news in the morning. Everybody goes tramping or hiking in the bush. They try not to get lost. And the height of luxury is to own a bach. It would be a bare bones cabin somewhere remote in the bush that has probably not even got power, or a narrow beach. And now that everybody knows about New Zealand, I don't get complimented on my English anymore. So I would like to use Peter Jackson as an example of what I think is uniquely New Zealand culture. Peter Jackson was an obsessed and successful filmmaker a long time before he made The Lord of the Rings. He got no support from the New Zealand Film Commission, which was the agency that should have been helping him along there. Now, I don't know if that's because he didn't suck up to the right people, he didn't know the right people. In New Zealand, everybody knows everybody, kind of. Or he just intimidated them with his talent. It's hard to know. But New Zealand has, in a sense, such a small country that every specialist area sort of has a few people who consider that their turf. And now that the rest of the world has realized what a great filmmaker he is, of course, New Zealand can't deny that. And he is now Sir Peter Jackson. But I think his situation is pretty much like what happens with a lot of New Zealanders who go overseas, work hard and become successful, but don't readily get recognized back home. And it's what they call a tall poppy syndrome. New Zealanders really, really favor equality, perhaps to a fault. So the good side of that is that they think everybody should have the same fair shot at everything. Women got the vote in 1890. Same-sex marriage was celebrated in 2013. It doesn't matter what job you have. If you're a doctor, that's great. If you collect garbage, that's great. As long as you're working and being a good neighbor, all of that is just absolutely fine. So the flip side, the resenting someone who sticks out of the crowd, is often referred to there as the tall poppy syndrome. And it seems that people reach success and it's recognized back home, or it's not. But the interesting thing is they don't seem to care. And I notice that New Zealanders across the world doing whatever they're doing eventually go home. They want to go home. And they seem really happy when they're there. It's just a different way of living. New Zealanders love New Zealand. And they're immensely proud of the Maori culture, the ecologically minded way the place is run, and the clean green image, which they can really genuinely project to the rest of the world. Here in the US, the corporations have rights, right? In New Zealand, a waterway has rights. And it's true that when you step off the plane in Auckland, the air smells different and the light is different, it looks different. New Zealanders were recycling because they had to, right? Because stuff was so expensive. And they were saving water and saving power because it was expensive and they had to. So they've been doing that stuff for a very long time. New Zealanders adore the bush. You may have heard the quip that Americans live to work. You know, success in your trajectory is an important thing. I think New Zealanders really work to live, to raise their family and enjoy being in New Zealand. New Zealanders still will travel, which probably helps cement how much they love their own turf. And in a place where race relations are so much better than the rest of the world, it's pretty easy to feel good about New Zealand when you're traveling. So, returning to the Maori culture, New Zealanders don't walk around like this all the time, right? If you went to New Zealand and you were paying to go to a tourist event and had Maori dancing, you'd see something like this. The early British tried to wipe it all out, but somehow it survived. This little thing here is a native Maori instrument. For many years, these things showed up in museums. People thought they were a cloak toggle or a button, something like that. I think that the remoteness of some places in New Zealand had something to do with this. In most small places, you'll see there's a marae. A marae would be a community centre for Maori, and that's where the tribe sort of would have their headquarters and meeting space. And if you watch the film Whale Rider, you can see the marae is very, very focal point in that community. These still exist, but they've survived the British. They survived the British trying to squash the native culture. And the elders managed to keep their information alive. And I think as New Zealanders got to travel and see that New Zealand was actually kind of special, they began to get more interested in the New Zealand culture. And the New Zealand culture is very respectful of the environment. They really treasure the environment. Their approach to it probably is not that unlike what a lot of native peoples do in the world, existing and honouring the stuff that keeps them alive. The Maori culture also has a very deep sense of wisdom and mana, honour, and all those things became very attractive. And something for New Zealanders to share in common against the rest of the world, I think. So when I was a kid, I grew up in an area that was largely white, kind of average middle class sort of space. And I don't remember using Maori words at all. But now, most New Zealanders know some Maori and all celebrate that identity. The government helped. It maintained some Maori language TV and radio. It provided training for Maori people who wanted to be teachers. It's always provided support for study of Maori stuff. So there's been ongoing nurturing of this culture. And it provided nursing care and special assistance in neglected areas. Now, I'm sure most people would say it wasn't enough, but I think the results stand for themselves. Maoridom is part of New Zealand culture now, in a way it wasn't when I was a kid. A good comment about good food might be, good kai for the puku, eh? And that would be, slow down, good kai for the puku, good food for the stomach, eh? Which New Zealanders take on to pretty much everything. The important aspects of Maoridom, the ceremonial treatment has also become very much standard stuff. So if you were coming here, it was the first class of the year, we might have a pōwhiri, which would be a time when I would talk about welcoming you and you would talk about coming here, and there would be a very eloquent exchange of words going on for maybe half an hour. And you would be expected to be able to speak articulately about your intentions here and how you feel about being here. There's a lot of emphasis on being able to converse in a very civilized way. I've also attended many wanangas, workshops, where people go away and have sort of a bit of a retreat and try to study something. Hangis, it's a type of food celebration, I guess. Every culture has those, right? And there's a great emphasis placed on valuing and hanging out with your whānau, your family. And that might loosely be the people who are just close to you, your friends. It's not necessarily blood relatives. But the most public face of this enthusiasm for Maori culture, I think, is the haka. And so I have a couple of clips here. I'm going to play two in quick succession. I'm going to save one to the end. So in this, you will see, this is obviously a bunch of men. They're going to be doing the men's version of a haka. In the very last clip I'm going to show at the end, you'll see that the women's one is a little bit more restrained. And the women do a lot of shaking hands. You see the stuff in Samoa too, I'm sure. Yeah. There's a lot of this sort of stuff going on. It is meant to be scary. And wide eyes. All this stuff is just part of the tradition of Maori gestures.
And now the All Blacks just waiting for the French to peel off the tracksuits, stand in front of them and receive the challenge of the haka. The challenge.
And I have one more that's got a bit of a translation here, which I thought might be useful.
The challenge has been made.
So, I mean, it sort of looks like that is just a sports thing, doesn't it? Because that's actually the New Zealand All Blacks, who are often the reigning world champions in rugby. Despite being a very small country, we routinely beat the Welsh, English, French, Samoans, the Australians, South Africans, French. So New Zealand, of course, is really into rugby. They're also really into cricket, and they're also into softball and women's soccer and you name it. But the haka shows up everywhere now, and most people know those words or a version of it. In fact, people are writing new ones for special events. So New Zealand recently came back into the national spotlight with a horrific assault on 2 Muslim mosques in Christchurch. Now, before that, the last time someone had a big shooting event was way, way, way back, I think in the 50s, where 14 people died when a guy became a little unhinged, definitely a mental health issue. That's the last time someone shot up anywhere in New Zealand. And I think in Christchurch, which is regarded as the most English-looking city in New Zealand, the most calm, sort of joked about in New Zealand for being overly polite. For that to happen there has been quite shocking. For this to happen in New Zealand at all has been a shattering experience for people who thought that New Zealand was immune from the gun-related violence and the terrorist attacks we see elsewhere in the world. I think what makes this a little bit different maybe in New Zealand is that it's so small that everybody would know of somebody in that, involved in that mosque. So that makes it more like a 9/11 type event, I think, for the US. And I have to say, I'm so immensely proud of our 37-year-old female Prime Minister, who wound up being Prime Minister sort of a last-minute thing before the election. And although she has 10 years sort of political work under her belt, she's still a very young person. And she immediately decided not to name the shooter. She took away that reach for notoriety. She immediately got government galvanized, and they instituted a ban on assault rifles. And they started creating more gun laws, and they started a buyback scheme. They figure they're going to spend about $200 million buying back guns. So how does this event change New Zealand going forward? Here we are so smugly thinking New Zealand's this incredibly safe place to live. I think this will be a bit like the French sinking of the Greenpeace Rainbow Warrior. When that happened, New Zealand was already feeling pretty strongly anti-nuclear. And the French had been doing nuclear tests in the Pacific. So it was natural that the Greenpeace people would park their flagship boat in Auckland's harbour. And when that happened, New Zealand just galvanized itself. It just dug in to being anti-nuclear to the extent it would not let US ships into the harbour if they wouldn't declare if they were nuclear free or not. So New Zealand risked alienating its strongest ally and a very big market for agricultural goods because they felt so strongly about pursuing the anti-nuclear stance. And I think that this tragic shooting in Christchurch is having the same effect. It's making New Zealanders who were sort of on the fence about guns feel very strongly about guns being a problem and supporting the anti-gun legislation. And I think it has made New Zealanders even much more fiercely rejecting racism and welcoming diversity. They really reject the anti-Muslim sentiment that's expressed everywhere else in the world. So, in closing, I would like to thank you all for letting me blather on at you. And I would like to invite you to put visiting New Zealand on your bucket list. I know it's a very long way and it's very expensive, but I promise you you'll love it and you'll want to stay. And I'm going to finish by saying e noho rā, which is goodbye. I'm leaving, you're staying. You would say haere rā to me. And I'm going to play a PBS clip of New Zealand kids doing the haka. Now this I think just shows you how much the New Zealand culture has just become a celebrated New Zealand thing for everybody. In this haka, I'm going to show you, if I can find where it is. In this haka, the students are telling each other, kia kaha, be strong. They're saying to the people who are involved in the shooting, kia haha, be strong. And they're saying that they honor all the people who lost their lives. Thank you.